We are now recording.
Welcome everybody to the December 2019 edition of the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour. This show is one I've been waiting for an awful long time. 4 years ago, or coming up 4 years ago, I did an event in Melbourne, Australia. And while I was there, one of my fellow presenters was a guy called Dr. Alex Defoe. And I was very intrigued by Alex's work because what Alex is doing is pure academic research in terms of extraordinary experiences. Now, I'll tell you a little bit about Alex in the sense of his background. Okay, I'm going to be reading something, and because I'm on my iPad, I'm going to be looking in that direction. So I'm not being ill-mannered here, but I want to get this right. Okay, so Dr. Alexander Defoe is an academic and transpersonal researcher with 10 years of experience in the science and teaching of psychology. He has received funding from the Australian Institute of Parapsychological Research, Parapsychological Association US, and the Society for Psychical Research in the UK to explore the mind-body problem in relation to accounts of out-of-body experiences, the OBE. Dr. Defoe's PhD was awarded at Monash University in 2016 for the study of perceptual processes in illusions of mind-body distortion, such as induced OBEs, body transfer illusions, and other altered states of embodiment. Alex teaches predominantly into undergraduate psychology programs with a focus on cognitive psychology and perceptual processes in humans. For example, object recognition and perceptual realism. He currently supervises several PhD students ranging from topics from modern technology use to uncover perceptual processes to the hard problem of consciousness. He has published his work in various academic journals. Now, this to me is intriguing material, because it is so important that this is actually taking place at the moment. And Alex, I know, is one of the guys at the leading edge. Now, Alex won't know this, but the last Consciousness Hour we discussed the experiential side of the experience. And now we're looking into the academic experience. So Alex, without greater greetings and everything, welcome to the Consciousness Hour show.
Thanks so much, Anthony. I'm really looking forward to talking about this topic.
Great, because I know, just to explain to everybody else, this has been a logistic nightmare for us because our producer, Dia Nunez, is over in Denver, Colorado. I'm just south of London, and Alex is in Melbourne, Australia. So you can imagine the time differences here is really quite complex. And it's one of the reasons why we've had difficulty in doing it in the past. So if Alex starts fading away or falling asleep, we know it's purely and simply because I think it's, what time is it there for you?
It's probably around 4 a.m. at the moment. So yeah, sorry everyone if I come across a little bit sleepy. But I think it is, as you mentioned, an important topic. So I did want to make the time so we can discuss this.
Thank you so much, Alex. It really means a lot to me that you've actually done this. So tell us a little bit about yourself. How did you ever get interested in this subject? What is it that intrigues you about it, and why are you doing it? What is it in your background that makes you interested in this?
Right, so I guess my background is a bit unusual. The reason that most people tend to get into research, and my approach was actually based on personal experiences that I had in the area with mystical or transpersonal phenomena, you could call. Having out-of-body type experiences, meditative experiences in my late teens really drew me to investigate these topics. I found that a lot of the literature at the time that I was directed to wasn't very satisfying, and that there was a lot of New Age literature out there and kind of explanations that took a number of leaps in logic that didn't really track very well. Having found some theories that did stand up a bit more, including some of your work was really fascinating at that time. But I really wanted to get into the topic and look at, can we, test out some of these theories and some of these models of out-of-body experiences and transpersonal phenomena. And it's, not as easy as we might think. As you mentioned, there's a large sort of phenomenological or personal dimension to the experience. And I suppose what I was interested in is that part, but then also the narrow approach of how can we actually conceptualize some of these topics and explore them in a more controlled scientific way. And specifically, I thought out-of-body experiences were a good topic that lends itself quite well to that sort of investigation, whereas some of the other, parapsychological topics like past lives, reincarnation, and so forth, obviously a lot more difficult to investigate. So in terms of starting somewhere, that's where I started my research, looking at OBEs, but of course venturing into other topics that are related as well.
Okay, can you tell us a little bit about your own initial personal experiences of OBEs? Because I'm quite intrigued whenever I have guests on here that's had the out-of-body experience and lucid dreaming and other phenomena, as to what your personal experiences were on that. So you can give us a couple of examples?
Sure. So in terms of my personal experience, I haven't had the sort of clear-cut definition out-of-body state. But when I was younger, I used to have a lot of, what you might call partial disembodiment sort of experiences, where you might be lying in bed and you kind of feel like, part of your body's lifting up, or you kind of have two bodies that are, separated from each other. As I mentioned, I haven't really had the full-on sort of sense of dissociation and floating away somewhere else, but partial experiences, also partial experiences in meditation of that loss of body self-boundary, which again, I wouldn't entirely call classical OBE. And this is what I actually found fascinating in my earlier research, that people describe these experiences so differently. And sometimes they will even talk about OBEs in terms of lucid dreams, in terms of dream-like states or meditation states, or, I've even had a lot of survey respondents and interviewees talk about drug-induced experiences as OBEs. And it's really interesting the broad spectrum of definitions you can have. And I found that a big starting point was really trying to collate all of the data and identify what is actually an OBE and what isn't an OBE. So in that sense, I have had a lot of, what you would call transpersonal experiences. I don't know if I would say I've had the full traditional sort of out-of-body experiences that people talk about. And I think in part that's important to differentiate from, what are the traditional characteristics of an out-of-body state versus a near-death experience versus transcendental meditation experience, which people still tend to conflate and consider as the same thing, whereas I think they're quite distinct.
That's interesting, because one of the big debates that I know that are in circles that I work in and work with over here in the UK and indeed internationally is the subtle difference between the out-of-body state and the lucid dreaming state. And are they just aspects of the same experience, or are they very qualitatively different and actually ontologically different experiences? I mean, have you any ideas on where you would think on that one? Because I'm sure this is something you've discussed in great detail in the past.
Definitely, yeah, it's a really good point. And some of the really good research around that is by Stephen LaBerge, who found quite a distinct overlap between lucid dreams and out-of-body experiences, and that in about, maybe 30 to 40%, we can see lucid dreams that may actually, translate or articulate into out-of-body states, or vice versa, out-of-body states that might start off, say you're having an out-of-body experience and you perceive yourself standing behind yourself or floating above yourself, but then that kind of, you float further away, that kind of transforms into a dream-like non-physical or imaginal realm. So he seemed to find that there was this percentage of overlap between lucid dreams and out-of-body experiences, where one might translate into another and vice versa, which complicates things even further, because I think they still are distinct experiences, but there seems to be this sort of overlap between the two. And if we look at parapsychological phenomena more broadly, and psi researchers like Dean Radin and Charles Tart that have looked at various factorial analysis of different psi phenomena, people that experience, one type are more likely to also experience other types of phenomena as well. So I think, it is important to distinguish between them, but also to acknowledge that a lot of the time these experiences can blend into each other. And, in the same way, we could take the analogy that someone's having a regular dream, and then they have some sort of reality test or trigger that actually turns that regular dream into a lucid dream. Then they might, again, lose lucidity and it might go back to a regular dream. So these states can be quite fluid in that sense. But I guess from my research interest, I've wanted to look at, realistic out-of-body experiences versus imaginal states, as I found that they're more fascinating, if you like, from a scientific perspective. So if someone's talking about, like a drug-induced experience where they've dissociated and floated off into a different dreamlike realm, that's interesting from a phenomenological perspective, but it's hard to study from a parapsychological perspective, where we might be wanting to look at what's going on in their perceptual experience. And in that sense, more classical OBEs, such as those that writer and researcher Graham Nichols talks about, where leaving the body and actually perceiving the direct environment around them. From my perspective, those sort of accounts are a lot more fascinating and lend themselves a bit more to understanding, what happens perceptually in those states.
That's interesting in itself, because you will know, and a lot of the watch, I don't know what to call them, watchers, listeners, or whatever the term is for the people that actually listen to this show or watch this show. But Graham Nichols has been twice to be guests on this show, and I know that both you and I have presented with Graham Nichols in the past. I think Graham was the year before I think I went down, or maybe it was the year after, wasn't it? I think when they did the event at Ayers Rock.
Sounds right. Yes.
Yeah, which is about right, isn't it? I think. But suffice to say, Graham's experiences are indeed fascinating, because unlike other experiences, and I strongly advise anybody who's listening to this or watching this at the moment, if you get the opportunity, scroll back or check the interview I did with Graham Nichols, because Graham's experiences are indeed intriguing, because one of his experiences involved not only was it veridical in the sense that it actually anticipated a future event that happened 5 days later. And he had witnesses to this event. So this is even more intriguing in many ways, because it tells us something about time flow within these altered states of consciousness. And Graham also talks about what he calls the Cerulean Effect. And this is something that actually be interesting to chat with you about, because various researchers I've spoken to and experiencers of the out-of-body experience all mention this shading into the blue. They actually, when they're in these experiences, the actual overall hue of the environment tends to be moving towards a different part of the spectrum. Have you come across this in your own research?
To some extent, probably not as much as I expected. So looking at the perceptual characteristics of OBEs, a lot of the time people do talk about them as being fairly realistic to the regular perception, but there are a few things that stand out. So some participants do talk about having a different color spectrum, or they have a certain tint to the experience. So some people talk about, like a blue or an orange tint over their perceptual field. I haven't found too much consistency around that, and that the experiences can vary quite a bit. Another common account is 360 type vision. So rather than just seeing a narrow field of vision, being able to see everything around them all at once, which is pretty fascinating. So I think that there definitely is some kind of altered perception in OBEs, and probably broadened perception as well. And it's interesting that researchers haven't really investigated that enough. So if we look to some of the formative literature on OBEs, they're kind of taken for granted, whereas some of those fundamental questions of, how is perception altered, what does someone's spatial environment actually look like in these states, researchers haven't really started off with those really important questions and fleshed them out in enough depth. So when we have, psi research trying to look at, is there something unusual going on in OBEs where someone is actually perceiving the immediate environment, the experiments aren't designed as well as they could be. So for example, some researchers tried to test this sort of, mind-body hypothesis that someone can leave their body and perceive the environment around them. But they haven't tested it in the most effective way. So to give one example of that, one experiment looked at using newspaper clippings to test perception out of body. But, again, participants couldn't really pick this up very easily. And first we have to ask the question, can we actually read a newspaper while being out of body? And part of the reason that some of these experiments haven't been so successful could be that perception, in out-of-body states hasn't been accounted for very well. So we haven't, taken into account these factors like 360 vision, the fact that there might be, color or depth impact on the experience, and other factors that have actually greatly limited what could be done with some of these experiments.
Of course, putting the my skeptic's hat on, which I tend to try and do occasionally, is that one could argue quite reasonably the reason that people cannot read newspapers or get information and bring it back is purely and simply because they're not actually out of body as such. It's some form of very elaborate hallucination. And they may believe they're outside of the body, but what they're doing is they're actually existing in their own model of what they think the external environment will look like. But what has always intrigued me in my own research and my book on out-of-body experiences, I was particularly interested in the work of Charles Tart, the work that Charles Tart did with Robert Monroe, and the particular case where Charles Tart asked Robert Monroe to see if he could visit his new house in California. And Robert managed to, and this is the strange thing, Robert managed to get about 50% of the information right, totally right, but 50% of it was totally ski-whiff and it was totally wrong. And I think this is where I have a problem with this, because if people turn around to me and say, I can get out of my body at will, my argument always is, well, it's an easy thing to do then. You get out of your body at will, you just go into the next room and tell us what's in the next room. But there's nobody I know that's ever been able to do that at will. Do you know of anybody you know that claims that they can do it at will and can effectively reproduce these circumstances? Or do you think this is, again, people believing they can, but they can't?
Really good question, and it's something that I've been wanting to look at a bit more and to try and consider, can more experienced out-of-body practitioners, if you like, or out-of-body experiences, can they actually have this experience more consistently? And it seems to be, if that's the case, it's a very small proportion of the population that may be able to do that. So, of course, Graham Nichols, other expert practitioners such as Robert Bruce here in Australia, for instance, claim to be able to have this ability. The degree...
I don't think Graham, I'd like to think that probably Graham doesn't, having met Graham a few times. I think Graham would readily admit that he can try and facilitate the circumstances, but I don't think he can actually do it at will. I don't think he's ever claimed that. I'm not corrected, but...
That sounds correct based on my discussions with Graham. Yeah, it's not so much that these people can just close their eyes or go into a state and have an out-of-body experience at will. I guess to maybe rephrase what I was saying, I think some of these individuals do tend to have out-of-body experiences frequently and probably are more susceptible to inducing them than those in the regular population. Yeah, so if we take 10 or 15 participants from the general population and compare them to someone like Graham Nichols or like Robert Bruce, we would expect that those in the second group would probably be more likely to have an out-of-body experience. But in terms of meeting someone that's just been able to do it at the drop of a hat or every single time, I haven't actually encountered any participants like that. But I think it is interesting that some people are more susceptible. So if we kind of look at that sample or that population of people that can induce them more willingly or with greater success, that would give us more possibility to explore the experience, and especially to test some of these ideas.
Okay, because that's interesting in itself, isn't it? In the sense that if they can spontaneously generate it, what is it telling us? And as an expert in human perception as well, it is intriguing, isn't it? Because we know that we internally generate a model of external reality inside our heads all the time. We're doing it now, effectively. There's no one-to-one relationship between our perceptions and what is actually out there, because the brain is creating an internal model from the senses and pulling it all together. And we know in terms of perception, to think there's a one-to-one relationship is naive realism, literally, in its terms. But effectively, what is your thoughts then on the way of reproducing the sensation of the out-of-the-body experience? For instance, the work of Olaf Blank. What are your opinions on that? Because I know that you've been doing some quite similar work down there in Australia in terms of this kind of inducing the effect by using virtual reality and videos and everything else. Have you been trying to reproduce that? And what's your opinions on that?
Yes, yeah, really good point. So there has been a lot of recent research, especially with the advent of virtual reality and other technology. There has been quite a lot of recent work done into body recognition and this notion of body ownership. So some of the earlier research around phantom limbs and this really famous experiment called the rubber hand illusion experiment demonstrated that our sense of body integration is actually pretty
Alex,
fluid.
could you just explain to the listeners, because I know about that experiment. It's fascinating.
Sure.
Can you just explain it a little bit?
So with the rubber hand illusion, generally there's a few variations, but the original one, the way that it worked is participants were asked to put both hands on a table in front of them so they could see, both hands inside. Then they were asked to put one of their hands underneath the table, and a rubber hand or a fake hand was placed in the same position as their real hand was a few seconds ago. And the experiment then applies various different variations and procedures. So they might start stroking the rubber hand or tapping the rubber hand, and that visual sense of actually having the rubber hand in front of us. It tricks our perception that it's actually our own hand. And, you might not think that you would be tricked by it, but if you actually have the experience, you may find that you're a bit confused about, is this actually your own hand or not? Especially with more recent sort of VR simulations of that are more realistic. They've done variations of, like the long hand or the long arm illusion where someone's arm becomes longer and longer, and they actually feel like, their arm could reach all the way across the room. So there's that sort of tactile realism that, it is actually their own hand that's been replaced. And what this research has actually unearthed is that our body representation is really amenable to those sort of tricks. And we find this in VR as well, having, participants in a virtual environment for a prolonged period of time, even if that's 20 minutes or so, and they're like in a very small environment, so they're crawling around like a small perceptual space or a really large perceptual space. When they take off the VR goggles, their perceptual experience takes a few seconds to kind of stabilize again. So that sense of representation is fairly easy for us to manipulate. And this is where some of the research around looking at, can we induce out-of-body states using these illusion conditions come about. And again, it kind of ventures into that territory of what is an OBE. As you mentioned, some of the researchers have stated that they can induce out-of-body states. So Blanke and Eckerson also talk about this out-of-body illusion, that we can apply the same principles, but rather to a rubber hand to the whole body. So someone puts on, a headset or VR goggles, and they perceive themselves standing on the opposite side of the room. I think they've done an experiment having someone with the perceptual experience of floating above themselves as well, looking down on their body. And the idea is that we're inducing that same out-of-body state. So in terms of your question, are they comparable? I think phenomenologically, they're different experiences, and I've touched upon this in various papers and in conference presentations at the PA, that they do seem to be quite distinct phenomenal experiences in the sense that usually with an out-of-body illusion, the person has that sense that they're above the body, but they tend not to move around like you would in an out-of-body experience where you can actually float around the room and explore other areas perceptually. It seems to just be restrained to that perceptual field in the same way as if we had a rubber hand illusion. You would have that experience just of the rubber hand, and then the experiment is over and the perception goes back to normal. So it is really a perceptually grounded experience. And a lot of the other phenomena that come with OBEs, like that sense of body separation, some people talk about a sense of like vibration or dissociation, tends not to accompany a lot of these body transfer illusions. What I find interesting though is, if we go back to that earlier point of, to what extent can these experiences flow in and out of each other? One of the research questions I have, for instance, is, can we generate really, really realistic body transfer illusion in, say, in VR that would actually then lead on to an out-of-body experience? That would be an interesting way to maybe induce OBEs in future, but I don't know if the protocols and the technology is there quite yet.
You might be interested. I don't know if you've come across the work of Dr. Carl Smith over here in the UK at all. He hopefully will be a future guest on the show, and Carl is doing some quite fascinating work. I was at one of his presentations at Breaking Convention at the University of Greenwich this summer, and one of the things he's doing is he actually has a VR camera attached to his head, which goes all the way around, 360, and it's fed back to somebody else who's in a virtual reality scenario headset themselves. And they do this for hours and days on end. And effectively, there is this great sense of disassociation and almost loss of self, I think. And I know we're planning to reproduce this going forward in the future, because I've worked with Carl on other events. But it's intriguing, isn't it, that this whole thing can be brought back to things like, I know the explanation put forward, for instance, is Doppelganger Syndrome, the idea of autoscopy or autoscopy, where the idea is, you see an image of yourself, which you can then project your consciousness into that other self. And of course, in OBE states, sometimes that happens, doesn't it, where somebody feels they're rising above their body. And it's quite intriguing, isn't it, how regularly, like Robert Monroe, I was looking down at myself and I could see myself lying there in the bed, which seems to be very similar to this kind of doppelganger syndrome. But I think you're quite right from what you say, that people that feed back to me say it's a very different sensation. One thing is an illusion of bodily position and the proprioceptive stimuli we're getting, which is completely different. And I think your point there was a fascinating one. I'd never thought about it before, was yes, the way in which you can move your position of perception around a three-dimensional space while you're in these areas. So this is very intriguing. So in terms of Olaf Blanke's reproduction of the OBE experience, because I know there was an awful lot of press about this, and I did a debate in London with Graham Nichols and one of his researchers at the Swedenborg Society in London about 4 or 5 years ago. And they've said that it's now explained it. It's now explained the out-of-body experience by this reproduction. I mean, as an academic researcher yourself, what's your opinion on that? Do you think it does explain it? I know you've said it, but could you just expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, really good question. So I think that this goes back to that broader debate around, the mind-body issue, and this can be traced back, 200-300 years back to Descartes' mind-body problem. And I think it would be convenient if we can say that we've resolved it, but I think the reality is that it's not quite yet resolved. And this comes down to a lot of debate around parapsychology research in general in the media, and the media doesn't tend to do a very good job of representing a lot of those findings. And that's not just with OBE or NDE research, but in general, any sort of parapsychology work. There was an experiment a few years back, actually almost half a decade back now, where they looked at some kind of hidden stimuli, hidden perceptual task, and the fact that participants registered a particular emotion to this perceptual task. They basically, they published this as like an emotional processing study, but the media ran with that and then kind of framed it in a way that this shows that there's no such thing as a sixth sense or any kind of broader perceptual experience, that it's simply people's unconscious mind that's playing tricks on them. And similar sort of explanations have been used to talk about synchronicity, intuition, that these are all processes that occur, due to the unconscious mind, or these phenomena that are completely explainable. And the same thing tends to happen with OBE and NDE research. The problem is that a lot of these studies aren't really situated well in the literature. So if we look back at out-of-body studies, these tend to go back quite far. And, Society for Psychical Research, for instance, has been logging anecdotes over OBEs. We can even look at, research by William James and Carl Jung, the early sort of psychoanalytic era, and even before that, talking about some of these states. Whereas the problem with recent studies that have tried to, explain these accounts, they've kind of approached it from the paradigm of perceptual processes rather than looking at, this long history of accounts that have been reported throughout decades. And it kind of ignores a whole body of literature by doing that, which is problematic even just from a basic scientific perspective, that researchers should be doing a thorough literature review of phenomena before talking about it. Whereas some really strict, what you'd call really strict materialists have a habit of not doing that and just focusing on, maybe the last 5 or 10 years. So to give an example of that, focusing on rubber hand illusions or body transfer illusions, and then saying that that's enough explanative potential to say that there's nothing out of the ordinary going on, but not really considering that broader accounts, such as some of the work by Charles Tart and others that have looked at out-of-body states. So I think, fairly this should be stated in a way that we don't know for sure. Maybe, as you mentioned, the materialist explanation is reasonably promising. Personally, I'm not convinced, but I think they make a reasonable argument for it. But in general, in science, we should be acknowledging both perspectives rather than just saying that, this one is correct or that one is correct. So I think, to kind of go back to your question, we can't really unpack this without looking at that broader debate. And it's a debate that's important to consider. It's still going on now. The media tends to present this in a way that it's been completely resolved, that it's not going on at all. But if we look at discussions with researchers, take a materialist such as Susan Blackmore, for instance, she's quite active still in scientific debate, and she does interviews and discourse around these topics. But if we look at the media and what the general person reads, they tend to get the message that it's been completely resolved. But in the academic side, it certainly hasn't. There's still debate and discourse going on about this topic.
Well, this is the thing that frustrates the hell out of me in the same way, and they will turn around and they will bounce back at you, and they'll turn around and use such tropes as the plural of anecdote is not the plural of anecdote is not proof. But effectively, if people have these experiences and the experiences are consistent across cultures and across society and across time, it is bad science to just ignore them. It's like the argument to say that, for instance, synchronicities or coincidences. One could argue that sometimes synchronicities or coincidences or precognitions are actually evidence of precognition. But of course, they'll say, well, no, it's not. And they will come up with all the excuses. And then their final fallback position is purely and simply that statistically, it could have just been coincidence. But how I'm a trained statistician myself. And, to me, there is a certain point where it stretches to such an extent the probability of this occurring as to be nonsensical. Yes, it could probably occur, but the reality, applying Occam's razor, which they love to apply to us all the time, applying Occam's razor says the most simple solution is the most simple one. And I'll give an example of this. That you'll still read in academic books now, even to this day, in terms of déjà vu. Déjà vu was supposedly explained by Robert Efron in 1961 with his visual pathways argument. It's dead in the water, that one, and yet they still cite it all the time and bring it forward. And to me, the only way we're going to understand the mind-body problem, the only way we're going to solve the hard problem of science that David Chalmers, your Australian philosopher, cited way back in 1999, is to look at these things in an objective way and say that just because subjective experience cannot be necessarily quantified in the laboratory or released does not mean it doesn't happen. I know that there was an awful lot of problems with the Darrell Bem experiments that took place a few years ago, and the furore over the Radin and Bierman experiments in terms of people actually anticipating horrible images and these kind of things. These are all experiments that seem to imply that we can actually perceive the contents of our own immediate future. But they're just in denial because it doesn't fit in with the paradigm. Now, this is what is so exciting about the kind of work you're doing for me as an enthusiastic layperson, is that you are pushing the boundaries. You're being brave enough to actually endanger your old academic tenure because you're willing to take these chances and look into things. So I'm really interested to know what are you planning? What are the things you are working on now? And what are the things you want to work on for the future?
Mm-hmm. So some really important points you made there, Anthony. I think it is really a paradigmatic issue a lot of the time rather than a statistical issue. And if we look at, results that have been published on Sci research, there's enough there to keep looking and to keep investigating. And it does come down to paradigms and what's the current paradigm in science and what sort of research is acceptable. That can be, difficult to work within the scope as well. So I do try and, continue research in this field of inquiry. But in the current climate of, various paradigmatic approaches, it's not always the easiest to pursue some of these research studies. So at the moment, I'm looking at predominantly the perceptual experience in OBEs. So we ran a study surveying a few hundred participants to try and get a sense of what their perceptual experience is like in the out-of-body experience. So really going back to basics and looking at when you're out of body, what do you actually see? What does the environment look like? How long does the experience last? And these sort of questions. And we're aiming to use that data to inform future experiments around trying to induce the out-of-body state. So at the moment, we're applying a paradigm, if you like, or a protocol by a researcher named Patricio Trisoldi in Europe, who's applied this approach called hypnotic-based induction of OBEs. And he has had fairly promising results with taking participants who've been susceptible to hypnosis and guiding them through an out-of-body type script to induce an out-of-body state. And then having some kind of target condition, so getting them to, can they float above the body and see particular objects or things around the room, and to basically, test that out and to replicate that as many times as possible. So we're looking at doing something fairly similar, but taking the data from the original study to inform that design. So specifically, avoiding objects that would probably be difficult to register, like not using newspaper clippings or anything like that, but using objects that are quite easy to perceive based on what participants have told us tends to be most perceptible in those states. So not doing anything, too radical or too drastic, but building on what seems to be working currently in research across the world, but also trying to refine that based on what we know, what we've learned about perceptual processes. So that should be, quite promising to see how that study unfolds. The main concern, I suppose, to go back to an earlier point is, to what extent will participants be able to induce these states? And, are they going to be able to do that in every instance? And of course, that makes it quite difficult to replicate some of these results, but that's the general plan moving forward.
Because that's so important, isn't it? I mean, it's, as you've mentioned a few times, it's a paradigm thing. It's the way in which we have what is considered to be the correct view of what is taking place in terms of everything is just physical, everything is just physical objects in fields. And there cannot be any explanation as to how inanimate matter, effectively electricity reacting with chemicals in my brain, can create me, my inner thoughts and feelings and anticipations. And that clearly, with the eliminative reductionists such as Daniel Dennett and the Churchlands and everybody else, would just be saying, that we cannot prove that within our present paradigm, therefore it doesn't exist. And it's a very, very peculiar worldview, isn't it? It's the idea that because we cannot measure it with our devices of one description or other, but the devices we're using themselves are not the correct devices in order to measure in the first place. And the challenge that researchers like you have is finding a way of reproducing these what seem to be ephemeral experiences under control conditions. And it seems that the very nature of the control conditions themselves seem to somehow stop the effect taking place, or will kind of move the effect and disguise it in some way. And I think the future needs to be that we need to just stop this kind of doctrinaire worldview. I'm reminded of the criticism and indeed the real destruction of Brian Josephson's reputation. I think he's the only living Nobel Prize winner in physics in the UK. And yet his reputation has been completely destroyed. They stopped putting his face on a stamp purely and simply because he's interested in psi phenomenon. And that is so wrong in so many different levels. It's almost crypto-fascism within the academic community, because you're not allowed to follow up on these subjects. As if you are, you'll be ostracized. Now, in terms of the things now that, as I said, the things that are exciting you at the moment, what I'd like to do now is to have a general discussion of where do you think we're going to go with this? Where do you think the world, what do you think are going to be the outcomes and everything else of these things? What do you think we're going to find? What would you like to be able to find, I suppose, in terms of your research? What would be your holy grail?
So I think it's important to be open-minded with doing any kind of research, and I think that is really important to have that kind of spirit of curiosity, and that is problematic when working within a particular paradigm, or having the threat that you can't do research in this or that particular area. I guess for us in the current academic climate, a lot of the time comes down to funding and industry support, but certainly in other places, researchers do get ostracized, as you mentioned, and they're told, you shouldn't be investigating this or that phenomena. So I think that's problematic, in an academic sense in general, of being able to work with the topics that you're most fascinated in. So in future, I'm not sure where the research will lead, and I think it is a little bit disappointing that we don't have more researchers asking some of these questions. I actually just the other week did an interview for Parapsychological Association asking, they were interested in asking how can we support the next generation of researchers in psi and parapsychological phenomena. And I raised a few points about, the situation is a little bit dire at the moment, in that first of all, not enough researchers are actually taking a real scientific interest in these topics. But secondly, that support is lacking as well. And actually, having mentors and supervisors that would encourage researchers to be quite open-minded and curious about these topics, that's quite lacking. And instead, they tend to be pushed into particular areas of investigation. So at this stage, I think I would be curious about knowing, really what distinguishes out-of-body accounts from some of these other phenomena that people talk about. So trying to develop better methodologies to test that. As you mentioned, the instruments that we have are not necessarily calibrated to capture these experiences very accurately. And in some ways, this almost goes, against the tenets of the current paradigm in psychology of trying to be as unbiased as possible. And, this sort of thesis that if some kind of phenomena is going on, we should be able to take a random portion of the population and test those people, and we should see the same thing over and over. It's kind of counterintuitive with parapsychology, because we're actually seeing these effects in a very small portion of the population. So in that sense, I'm hoping to work towards developing more refined methodologies for actually, capturing some of these experiences and looking at, what is it about the personality characteristics or, other individual differences about these people that are having these accounts more often. But then also, can we induce them more frequently? And I think, my hope isn't that we'll necessarily answer the bigger problem or, the bigger sort of issues around this topic, but at least that will get a bit closer to understanding what's going on and, sorting these experiences and distinguishing them a bit more clearly. And hopefully that will pave the way for more new and exciting research on the topic.
Because it's intriguing. I particularly like your line, the idea of actually pursuing psychological types in terms of particular individuals. What is it that makes a particular individual more likely to be psychic or more likely to have out-of-the-body experiences? Is it a neurological thing? Or is it a personality trait? So effectively, could we, using psychometric testing, OPQ, 16PF or whatever, and come up with a particular typology of individual that is more susceptible? And then we could actually find those individuals and develop them in some way. But of course, if it is proven to be a psychological type, the implication is then that it's a psychological effect rather than a physiological effect, rather than related to particular aspects of neurotransmitter relationships within the brain, whether it is something to do with the release of glutamate in the brain, whether it is endogenous DMT, if we can argue that endogenous DMT excreted by the pineal gland, these kind of things. These are areas of research that we need to be moving towards. And I've long argued that what is happening is we're having siloism a little bit, you know, in the sense that the neurologists and the psychologists and the quantum physicists and even, dare I say, the cosmologists aren't necessarily talking to each other, in the sense that there should be cross-fertilization of ideas in such a way that when the group works together, there'll be a little light go on, and you as a psychologist will suddenly spot something and say, do you know, I hadn't realized that this known neurological or neurochemical effect engenders this kind of experience. And, you know, effectively, as long as we've got people that are in denial of these things, we're going to get trapped in it. Now, one of the things that I'd like to ask, I do these little speeches, you know, halfway through these things, so just ignore me on this. It's sort of word association in many ways, and I just start going off on a tangent. But effectively, in terms of the people you have worked with, have there ever been any kind of extraordinary experiences that either you have witnessed or things that you've come across in your research that you thought, you know, that really is quite incredible. I can't quantify it, I can't prove it superbly, but I know that this thing happened. Are there any events like that? Because I know that you're well experienced in these areas. Are there any ones where you thought, wow, that really is quite uncanny?
Yeah, there are a number of peculiar accounts that tend to come through. Like many of them will be fairly standard sort of out-of-body accounts, but you know, you'll get the odd account that really takes you aback because it's really quite unusual. So, for example, people talking about having an experience of, you know, going into a different time period, or, you know, perceiving themselves earlier on in life, and then, you know, talking to people after that out-of-body state, you know, family members and so forth, and asking about, you know, particular details and getting really specific information around that. I've always found that sort of thing quite fascinating, and sometimes the level of elaboration that people will go into, it's quite fascinating that they have these sort of experiences. Sometimes I'm, you know, sitting there reading them and fairly taken aback. So those sort of accounts, you know, too many to think of off the top of my head, but in general, transcendent experiences are usually quite fascinating. So I try and limit my research to looking at out-of-body states that are perceptually grounded in this, you know, physical perception. But some of the accounts that come through talking about other experiences or non-worldly sort of states, again, the amount of detail that people go into with those sort of accounts is quite fascinating. Fairly similar sort of descriptions or a similar scope to those we might find in works like this by Eben Alexander, talking about these sort of very rich sort of visual landscapes that you wouldn't really even be able to fathom if you tried to imagine it. So those sort of accounts really kind of, you know, they take you back sometimes, and quite fascinating to read about.
Excellent, because I mean the whole Eben Alexander thing is intriguing, isn't it? In the sense that he was somebody that was very, very negative about the NDE experience. And of course, he then experiences the thing himself. And this is something I find quite regularly when I do debates with skeptics and with scientists. It's always the strange thing, you know, they will say, oh no, it's all nonsense, it's all rubbish and everything else. Then you'll go out and you have a few beers with them. And then after a few beers, it'll be, yeah, I don't believe in it all, but I did have this experience once, which I'd never been able to explain. And then I give a wry smile and I listen to experience. And I will always turn around and say, well, why don't you then talk about this in your papers? And we have the same reaction. It's no, I couldn't be allowed to do that because, you know, it would destroy my reputation. So we're coming back to this. But I think the major problem here, well, it's not a problem, but it's an issue of the world we are in, because there are an awful lot of people out there that use the paranormal and use psi and all these other things as a way of earning money and a way of pretending that they have skills that they don't have or abilities that they don't have. And of course, every time somebody is proven to be a charlatan and every time somebody is proven to be cheating or whatever, it damages everybody. You know, and these huge claims that are made by people, you know, the point we were making earlier on, you know, I can get out of my body straight away. And of course, every time these individuals are tested, well, no, the special circumstances whereby I can't. You know, and the skeptics will then have a heyday with that. And it's very, very curious and very, very strange and quite frustrating, because it's people like you and I, particularly you, and the people I've interviewed here, that are really trying hard to understand the greatest mystery of all, consciousness and conscious experience. What is consciousness and how does it exist in a seemingly materialistic universe? You know, the point you made before about Cartesian dualism, and the idea of, you know, there seem to be two separate things that exist within the world. There's the inner world of consciousness and there's this kind of external world of physical objects. But of course we know in quantum physics, the physical objects, when you start analyzing them and go down to the subatomic level, just disappear. There is no physicality out there. You know, there's a wave function that is collapsed by the act of measurement or the act of observation that just could have been anywhere. Subatomic particles can be anywhere until they choose to be in one place or another. So in our final few minutes we've got now.
Can I ask a question, Anthony?
Yeah, Dia, please do. Yeah, please.
And I know
this is our producer, Dia, by the way, folks.
I'm just sitting here listening to your beautiful conversation, and this is a very mundane question, but it's deeper than what we're presenting. And what I mean by this is the scientific community, your science, why such the deep-seated fear is what I'm trying to understand. That this could potentially be the greatest discoveries of like mankind. And when I say that, I'm not joking. What is the real deep-seated fear? What is science afraid of is what I'm trying to figure out.
Good point, Alex. What would you say?
Yeah, it's a good point. I think, again, this comes down to this issue of paradigms, and that the current paradigm is challenged probably a bit too much by introducing some of these ideas. You know, if we look at the basic sort of principles of physics and biology are quite challenged potentially by, you know, the promise of psi phenomena existing. So, yeah, look, I think that there probably is some fear for the general person. Like generally when I've spoken to people about parapsychology or, you know, paranormal phenomena, they tend to be a bit unsettled about it. They tend to, you know, start thinking, you know, are they going to be possessed, or, you know, a UFO is going to come down and abduct them. So I think the general person, I think there is some level of fear around that. With the scientific community, I'm not sure if it's driven so much by fear, but the scientific process does tend to be quite narrow and based on paradigms and based on, you know, looking at things very carefully. And unless we're 100% sure about something, not really moving forward with that theory or that approach. So, yeah, look, I don't know to what extent it's driven by fear. I think that scientists in general, like quite often people come up to me and say, why are scientists so closed-minded? I think generally scientists are more open-minded than the general person. I think that they're just very careful in accepting the conclusions unless we have very good evidence for them. And I think, yeah, again, it comes down to a paradigm issue. I wasn't trained in parapsychology specifically until graduate level. I think the fact that people are not introduced to these topics, then not even starting to think about them unless they really go out of their way. Then, of course, if you're confronted with a really different or radical idea that challenges your worldview, of course, there's going to be some hesitation or some reluctance about accepting that. But, you know, again, scientific paradigms, if we go back to the age of Freudian analysis, if you talked about mindfulness-based therapy in that age, everyone would look at you really strangely and ask why you're not accepting Freudian psychoanalysis as the best treatment for various psychological problems. The same way we confront these paradigmatic issues today.
I think I'd add to that and say that the present materialist reductionist model of science has been phenomenally successful. You know, effectively the technology we are using now is from materialist reductionist analysis. You know, you take something apart in order to know how it works. But of course, the problem is with consciousness, you take the brain apart and you find nothing. You confuse what you think is happening in the brain that you're measuring as being thought or being hopes or fears or qualia or whatever. And this is where the difficulty lies. And of course, as long as you're going to take one bit out the edifice, the whole edifice could collapse. And suddenly we're in this position, like I was discussing with Dia earlier on before you came on Alex, the issue that they've actually suddenly discovered that it's highly like the universe isn't flat, which means if the universe isn't flat, effectively it's spherical. And if it's spherical, it means if you start in one point, eventually you end up in the point you started in. And of course, if space and time are the same thing, it applies that time is the same thing, that time is cyclical. And of course, suddenly there are all these questions being asked, and they're saying that maybe our model is not right. But this is how scientific revolutions take place. You know, the scientific revolution, the Aristotelian model, the Newtonian model, they all were very good explanators of the world as it was seen. And the scientists would use that worldview because, you know, you look at Aristotelian science, they, you know, with their epicycles and everything else and the way an object moved, they thought it through to the nth degree. It made eminent sense to them because that's what the world was telling them. And it's the same with our modern science. I don't think scientists are anti what we're doing. Far from it. I think if we could prove it to them, then the doors would open. But it's our challenge to do that. It's our challenge to convince them and bring them on side, but not by making huge claims like an awful lot of the New Agers do and talking this kind of New Age waffle and word stew that they come out with, and particularly this exact quantum physics that they've now got hold of, that suddenly, you know, everything is quantum and that explains everything. You've got to understand what quantum physics is really telling you. You know, you've got to understand Heisenberg's uncertainty principle. You have to understand Pauli's exclusion principle, because these are the things that work, you know, in many, many ways. But that's my little speech on that. Alex, I am sure that there's an awful lot of people out there listening to this are saying, I really need to contact this guy. I really need to check out his work and everything else. So in the final few seconds, can you give us how people can contact you, your website and everything else? Dia will put it up anyway later, but just so you can let people know more about how they can contact you.
Sure, definitely. So the easiest way is probably through my website, just alexdefoe.com. And people can find me on social media and my contact details there, and other information if they're interested in current research that I'm doing.
Excellent. That's really good, because I know you have a whole series of papers that I'll be starting to plow my way through in the next few months, because they look absolutely fascinating. I mean, one here, auditory hallucination predict likelihood of out-of-body experience. I mean, auditory hallucinations, we didn't even get onto that and how they can be linked in one way or another to OBEs. That is a fascinating idea. I wish I'd spotted that before. That is that's a doozy. That is so good. That is so good. Maybe at some stage we can discuss that one, because so many people talk to me about auditory hallucinations as well. So it's fascinating the work you're doing. Alex, I have absolute admiration for you in what you're doing. You guys are so important to us guys that are doing all the writing, because without you, we wouldn't have the material. So you guys are so important. And it was wonderful meeting you in Australia a few years ago. And I'll be watching your work with great interest for the future, and I hope a lot of the listeners will be as well. Okay, everybody, thank you very much for listening in and checking this out. Alex Defoe down there in Melbourne, Australia, and as always, the magical, ephemeral person of Dia Nunez that will pop in occasionally and pop out again. Without Dia, this show could not occur. So thank you very much, everybody, and we'll speak to you again in a month's time, or we'll see you in a month's time. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.